Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming to this dialogue, which is our final dialogue for the fiscal 21 academic year. Today, we're going to continue a discussion that we started with Dr. Crystal Fleming. And she's going to talk with us about race and how we can take this current situation that we're in from a moment to a movement and do things to activate and support what we believe should be done around race. Now, whether we like it or not, it's been the primary focus of a lot of our conversations on the television with people that we meet and in the workplace. And so we want to make sure that we are staying relevant and current and helping to support you in these areas. Now, before we get started, there are a few Zoom housekeeping guidelines. And we ask that you mute yourself unless you're speaking, and use your video on or off at your own level of comfort. I know for some folks, having this many people on one session can cause some bandwidth issues, so you should feel free to use that as you need to. The chat feature is going to be enabled during this time. However, we're going to hold questions for Dr. Fleming until the end or until the Q&A session. So we hope that you will feel free to use the chat feature as things come up, inspirations, questions, comments, use the chat feature, and we will be going back to that during the Q&A session. The dialogue is being recorded and will be uploaded onto the YouTube channel. And finally, please engage as you see fit. There's a reaction button. Please use that liberally to let us know where you're at, how you're feeling, and let Dr. Fleming know how you're at and where you feel and how you're feeling. Now on to our program. Race and politics, race and policing, race and education, race and access. Americans continue to grapple with these constructs in ways that have drawn the attention of people from around the world. When we last gathered, we were about 6 months into the protests related to the murder of George Floyd, where many took to the streets, not only in America, but worldwide, to protest racial injustice in America. For the most part, these protests have ended, and we are now post the Chauvin murder trial. Now, for some, this may bring some semblance of closure, but for many, it has made answering the question of, so what now, even more imperative. And the fact that there have been several more deaths of Black people at the hands of police since this verdict does not support the notion that we're ready to bring closure to this horrible part of American life. In this follow-up session, Dr. Fleming is going to explore strategies for powerfully moving into action towards equity and breaking down barriers in the process. Dr. Crystal Marie Fleming is a critical race sociologist, the author of 3 books and an internationally recognized expert on racism and anti-racism. Her work empowers people of all backgrounds to become change agents and dismantle white supremacy. She's professor of sociology and Africana studies at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on racism and ethnic relations, sociological theory, and qualitative methods. Dr. Fleming earned a PhD and a master's degree from Harvard University, so she knows our environment as well. And as she shared before, her own perspective, I'm sure she'll have some comments for us today about the Harvard perspective and environment. She graduated with honors in sociology and French from Wellesley College. At Harvard, she was elected president of the Graduate Student Council at GSAS and co-organized the first university-wide day of service in 2007. Her first book, Resurrecting Slavery, Racial Legacies and White Supremacy in France, uses critical race theory and qualitative research to significantly advance scholarship on racism in France and Europe. Her critically acclaimed primer, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, on racism, white supremacy, and the racial divide, combines memoir, critical race theory, social commentary, and satire to debunk common misconceptions about racism. Her latest book, Rise Up, How You Can Join the Fight Against White Supremacy, is a YA nonfiction work that explores the roots of racism and its modern day legacies, while empowering young people with actionable ways to create a more just and equitable world. It will be published in October. She's currently co-editing a fourth book, Beyond White Mindfulness, Critical Perspectives on Racism, Health, and Well-Being, and completing a fifth project, Words to Remake the World, A People's Dictionary for Social Change. A bold, dynamic, and influential voice on Twitter, her tweets on racism and politics are frequently cited in major news outlets. Her work and commentary are regularly featured in a range of national and international media, including Courier International, Newsweek, Black Agenda Report, the CBS Sunday Morning News Show, The Root, NPR, and the New York Times, among others. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Fleming. We're so excited and appreciative that you accepted our invite to come back. So let's welcome her with a virtual round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea, for that warm welcome. And thank you for your virtual applause. I see you, those of you who have your video cameras on, and those of you who have your virtual hands. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who organized this event, invited me back, and those of you who've shown up today for what I hope is a useful discussion that will help move beyond words into action and help folks who may be already involved in some anti-racist work, as well as those who may be new to thinking about how do I actually, again, move beyond words or beyond reading or beyond awareness into work that will actually support equity and justice. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we'll get started. Okay. So I told the organizers of this event that I was really excited about the title. I didn't choose it. So from moment to movement. And it just happens that we're very much on the same page in terms of what I hope can come out of today's discussion. I left our last engagement in December, the last dialogue, having provided an overview of some basic tenets of really just the history of racism and white supremacy in our country, but also insights from critical race scholarship, some of which actually came out of Harvard, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about today. But today's discussion is really going to focus on concrete steps that you can consider. Some of these steps you may already be involved in taking. That will actually promote equity and social justice work over the long term. Usually I leave these steps to the end of my talks, and today we're actually going to have them a few times. You're going to see them in the beginning. We're going to then get into the details with what that kind of looks like in terms of concrete steps for anti-racist change. And then when we open up for Q&A, I'm also going to want to know, in addition to your questions, if you have suggestions or insights about action steps that you may already be involved in that you'd like to share with this audience today. And the image that you're seeing, you're going to see it a bit later in the presentation, is from a solidarity protest that occurred about 10 years ago. And this was to support an employee at Harvard who's partially disabled, Marvin Bird. Some of you may know about this, some of you may not. I'm going to come back to it later, but it's an illustration of what we're going to be talking about today: protest work, anti-racist mobilization, and solidarity more broadly, right where you are at Harvard, as well as beyond. So you've already heard a pretty comprehensive overview of my bio from Andreas. Thank you very much for sharing that. I would just add, as I'm sure I did in December, but for those who are new to my work, I call myself a self-proclaimed wig snatcher of white supremacy. And part of what that means, if you don't know what it means to get your wig snatched, you're about to find out. But concretely, what it also means is that in spaces like this, but lots of institutional spaces that are putatively about addressing race, my role is to really leverage that and to bring folks into dialogue about racism. So moving from race to racism, and from racism to a specific and clear critique of white supremacy. We'll talk more about what that entails in terms of sort of understanding how systemic racism and institutional racism is actually embedded into our everyday practices and the context where we work and live. But that's a running thread throughout my projects, whether we're talking about the books I've written, both scholarly, as well as my latest book for young people, as well as the work I do in sort of public speaking and outreach work. So really empowering people to understand what white supremacy is beyond the KKK. But we're going to talk about the KKK today because they had a chapter at Harvard, and we need to address that. But beyond sort of extremism and understanding white supremacy, as Dr. King did, as an ideology and a practice that was embedded into our culture very intentionally, and still is embedded in our culture today. As you've heard, I did complete my PhD and master's at Harvard. You see, I've described myself as an alumna, survivor, and critic. What I mean by that is that I survived, the intersectional difficulties of being a Black queer woman at an institution like Harvard. And it was a unique experience having come from Wellesley, where I completed my undergraduate studies and felt, although no campus is perfect by any means, and Wellesley has its challenges with systemic racism as well, but I experienced my education at Wellesley as a very empowering environment for women. For me at the time, it was, as a young woman, it was very important for me to be in a space where there was no question about my intellectual ability or my belonging as a woman. Coming to Harvard from that environment at a time when there was a president of the university who was questioning the intellectual ability of women, the presence of women in science, it was horrific. And that kind of patriarchal sexism is not surprising at a place with Harvard's history, but it's also important to understand that sort of institutional sexism and patriarchy is intertwined with the history of racism, white supremacy, elitism, and ableism as well. And we're going to talk about the eugenics movement and how Harvard has been described accurately as the brain trust of eugenics, which is just not merely a thing of the past, but is still a significant problem today. Some of my research, as you've heard, addresses racism and anti-racism in the US and in France, and I continue to be interested in these developments in Europe. And it's true, I am finishing up a project on mindfulness with some colleagues in psychology at Brown and Northwestern. And some of my own empirical research will be exploring over the next couple of years how African Americans experience and practice mindfulness and meditation. You can learn more about my work, obviously my website, and connect with me as I put in the chat on Twitter at Always the Self. I was laughing a little bit where it was mentioned in the bio that my tweets are often cited in the media. It's also true that they're often not cited in the media. They're used sometimes, and this is unfortunately common practice I find on social media where words are taken without attribution. In any case, you can see me and some of my words on Twitter. So this is the book that you heard about and that I just mentioned, also a book for young people, which I'm very gratified to say is finally done and in production and coming out this fall with Henry Holt. Rise Up, How You Can Join the Fight Against White Supremacy. And I'm really, really excited to bring some of the knowledge that, I write about in my scholarly work and teach about in a university classroom to an even larger audience, this time of 12 to 18-year-olds. And if anyone has tried to explain anything related to racism to young folks, you have my abiding respect, because this was a really, really, really hard book to write. It might be the hardest thing I've ever written, because part of what's necessary is distilling, of course, an incredibly complex history that spans centuries, but also allowing for young people to see that historical narrative of the emergence of modern racism and white supremacy, but also see the work that's been done for generations to challenge and dismantle white supremacy, and to see themselves in that story as well, that story of activism and resistance and protest. That is something that we're going to be thinking about together today. So that book, once again, is coming out this fall. And if anyone has questions about that topic, I'd be happy to engage that in the Q&A. So a lot has happened in the last 24 hours, in the last week, in the last months, but in particular since the last diversity dialogue, where I joined you in December. And so I do just want to begin with some reflections on some of that context. And really, it's a moment by moment, second by second kind of thing when you are someone who works on issues of inequality and inequity and racism. But specifically since December, we have seen, of course, in January, the white supremacist takeover of the Capitol and hordes of anti-democratic, and I mean that in both senses of the word, mobs overtaking the Capitol building for the first time in its history, a Confederate flag being unfurled within its walls, and a noose erected in front of the Capitol building in case there was any ambiguity about the white supremacist and anti-Black and anti-Semitic and just horrific motivations of that mob. And I think in the context of so many Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people, people of color being targeted disproportionately by police, dying in police encounters. Some of you may or may not know, but Indigenous people, depending on the year of the data that you're looking at, are killed at the highest rate per capita in police encounters. It alternates between Indigenous people and African Americans. And in the context of that, and seeing Black children being murdered even in their sleep, Ayanya Stanley Jones, it's a 7-year-old Black girl who was murdered in Detroit some years ago while she was sleeping. Breonna Taylor, of course, killed also, having been asleep in her own home. And just countless examples of racially marginalized people being dealt with in the most brutal and inhumane of manners, contrasted with the kid gloves that we saw the Capitol Police overwhelmingly, with some few exceptions, the kid gloves that we saw deployed against this mob, which resulted in multiple deaths, including the death of a police officer who was brutally killed, and others who were killed in the mayhem. Or we might think of Kyle Rittenhouse and numerous examples of white Americans, particularly white men, who are not just armed and dangerous, but have just carried out a mass murder and who are somehow arrested without incident. It's evidence of our ongoing racial and gender hierarchy that continues to disproportionately render Black and Brown people vulnerable to state violence as well as vigilante violence. I'm thinking here also of last year's killing of Ahmaud Arbery, right, which was a white mob, which is also consistent with our nation's history. The context also of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the upsurge in vicious anti-Asian hate crimes being committed by people of a wide variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds, including African Americans and people of color and white people from coast to coast. And that context of the surge in vicious hate crimes and violent brutality against Asian Americans, including mass murder in Atlanta, that occurring in the political context of a former president explicitly stigmatizing Asian people, blaming them, scapegoating them for COVID-19, calling it the China virus or Kung flu, and there being a reckoning with the violent impact of those words on Asian people in this country. Stop Asian Hate, of course, is the hashtag that's emerged to raise awareness about this and also to stop it. Many people across the world watched with rapt attention this week as we saw the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. These are images of marches and protests that occurred on the eve of the trial a few weeks ago. And even as the verdict was being read, we had news of a 16-year-old, I believe there were conflicting reports, first it was 15 and 16, but a teenage girl, Black girl, who was killed by police minutes before the reading of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. Already a familiar narrative emerging that blames that child for the inability of police to engage in that encounter, which was a violent one, but to de-escalate and engage in that encounter without murdering a child. And we could go down the line. Adam Toledo, a Latino youth in Chicago, who was killed in a police encounter. And we saw, any of you who were watching that news in recent weeks, we saw an African-American mayor, Democrat mayor, appear to simply lie about the circumstances of that killing, even after having access to the video, which was eventually shared with the public. We could go down the line. Daunte Wright, murdered by Kim Potter at the same time of the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, with this time officer claiming that they got their taser and gun mixed up and just happened, oops, to murder, in this case, a 20-year-old Black father. So we have a lot, and God only knows what's happening at this moment, the names that we don't know, the cases where there's not a bystander with a camera ready, as in the case of George Floyd, a teenager who happened to be present and brave enough to film what was happening. And that, of course, footage proving eventually to be critical in debunking the lies that flowed from the police department in its efforts to protect itself, and Chauvin included. So what does it mean? What does it mean that we've seen a guilty verdict in this case? Does it mean that we can now relax from our efforts to promote equity and justice? I hope you know, having shown up for this, I hope that you are the kind of person who already knows that that's not the case. And in fact, as I'll explain throughout the remainder of my remarks, one of the most important insights about racism is that we're dealing with systemic and institutional problems. And so whether we're talking about policing, or we're talking about higher education or K through 12 education, or we're talking about our healthcare system, which might be better called a death care system at this point. But whatever institutional sphere we're talking about, we're not dealing with a problem of individuals. And so an individual, I should be clear, we're not only dealing with the problem of individuals. And so an individual being convicted in the absence of the system being changed or even eradicated guarantees that we're going to see more Derek Chauvins, and we're going to see more incidents that are repeated in a reliable we're going to see more of this pattern that's been reproduced reliably over the course of generations. One of the important studies that I think shed light on not just the systemic problem, but the cultural problem that we're dealing with, specifically with police violence against Black people, is research from the Economic Policy Institute, which demonstrates that there is a link, positive correlation between historical lynchings and present day or contemporary police killings of African Americans. That is, in counties where there's historical evidence of lynchings, we see an uptick in police killings of Black people. The Economic Policy Institute also shows that that relationship is actually negative for white individuals killed by police. That is, in counties where there's historical lynchings of Black people, we see fewer white Americans killed in police encounters. So we're dealing not just with systemic problems, we're dealing with cultural and historical problems, and it's going to take ongoing, unrelenting work on the part, not merely of individuals, but of communities working in solidarity over the long term to change this. So one verdict, I hope it's clear, is certainly not enough. I'm sharing with you now some data from an NPR Ipsos poll. This is from last year, and they asked, since the death of George Floyd, have you personally taken any action to better understand racial issues in America? And I'm sharing this because, of course, today's theme is from, moment to movement. So taking action, and what does that entail? And I want you to see the patterns in this data. So overall, only 36% of people replied yes, that they had personally taken, which I think is like the most minimal effort, right, is to just better understand what's going on. That's not even taking action. That's simply awareness. So only 36% of people said, you know what, I think I need to look more into these issues. And this is even in the context of what still appears to be unprecedented interest in anti-racism and people flocking to buy anti-racism books. And yet still it's a relatively low percentage of the population. 55% of people said, nope, know what? I have not taken any efforts to better understand these issues. And among those who replied yes, we see that white Americans are doing the least. White Americans are doing the least. And, you know, this is something that Martin Luther King observed and talked about as well, that white Americans were doing, to paraphrase King, very little to understand racism and racial matters in their own community. But the data still bear this out, that we see a higher percentage of people who are actually targeted by systemic racism, perhaps unsurprisingly, who are taking steps to better understand what's going on. So 30% of white Americans compared to 41% of Black respondents. Hispanic, which is an ethnic category in most polling data, but 51% of Hispanics and 49% of Asians replied that they are doing more work to better understand these issues. Of course, awareness is often a precursor to action, but I share this so we understand the gravity of the problem that we're dealing with, where we have tens of millions of people in this country who are still not doing the work. And in a way, although that can be demoralizing, in another sense, we also know that throughout history, we have seen great change occur, not because everyone did it, but because there was a critical mass of people who attained awareness and leveraged that awareness into action. Social movements that have been successful were not successful because everybody got on board. So the question is, how can we build the critical mass, and how can we, both as individuals and community members, be a part of this ongoing work, which includes ongoing efforts to deepen and broaden our awareness. So I want you to consider a few questions as I get into the remainder of my presentation, to keep these questions in mind. What are you doing to actively protest and challenge systemic racism and anti-Blackness and white supremacy? And we could add on, and we could add settler colonialism and anti-Asian hatred. What are you doing? Even beyond seeking out information, attending events, reading books, have you gotten involved? And maybe you didn't have to wait for George Floyd to be lynched to get involved, or for Breonna Taylor to be lynched to get involved in anti-racist action. What have you been doing? And I'm asking this too, because when we get to the Q&A, as I mentioned, I'd like for folks who are already engaged and mobilized to share some of what you've been doing, so folks can learn from you. Another question I'd like you to consider is, what kind of resources and policies and practices would actually help bring about the anti-racist change you'd like to see? This is also very important for moving beyond words or beyond a moment. So we think about what kind of long-term changes, institutional changes, budgetary changes, political changes would be supportive of the anti-racist transformations you'd like to see, both at Harvard, in your local community, and more broadly. And finally, how can we learn from and support people and organizations that are already doing the work to build a better world? Now, I am honored to be your speaker today and your facilitator, but I'm also going to keep it real. I'm a professor. I'm a full professor at a Research One university that comes from an elitist academic background. I am not the main person that you or anyone else should be getting your anti-racist homework from. And I say this in my work as well, in my books. I point folks, yes, to scholarship, and scholarship is important, and scholar activism is important. And I draw upon the legacies and work of W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, who did both. But we really need to learn from organizers and activists and community members on the ground. There's too much elitism in academia where the focus is mainly on what scholars are saying. We need to bring community members and organizers and educators who are outside of traditional academia into that conversation. And so I'd love to see, if it's not already been done, future dialogues, maybe even to not necessarily be called diversity dialogues, but we could talk about that in the Q&A. What do we gain and lose with the rubric of diversity, as opposed to social justice dialogues or equity dialogues or reparations dialogues, but also to bring community members and activists into the center of those discussions, and in dialogue with scholars as well, as appropriate. So this is a banner that was often, all too often, unfurled by the NAACP when a lynching took place. And as mentioned earlier, we see empirically a historical connection between lynchings and current sort of institutionalized policing practices that render Black people more vulnerable to being killed by state violence. And so I really, really hope that by the end of today, everyone in this audience has a clear understanding of why we will keep seeing lynchings unless we demand systemic and cultural and political change and commit ourselves to advocating for that change. We will keep seeing these lynchings take place unless we act. So what does it take to create movement? In the last chapter of my book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, I suggest 10 concrete steps for building not just awareness, but collective action around anti-racism and social justice more broadly. I'm not going to get into all 10 of those ideas today, but I am going to share 5 concrete steps. Some of them align with the book, some of them are beyond that text, but I want to already preview some of them in a moment, and then we're going to go step by step and then hear from you at the end. And as we think about the concrete steps that can bring about the change we seek, I think we also, again, need to think beyond the rubric of diversity and get clear about, well, what is the kind of movement that you're trying to produce? This is a tweet that was written and shared from Bernice King earlier this month in the context of the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King, the killing of Martin Luther King, her father. And she wrote that inclusion does not equal equity. Diversity does not equal justice. Tolerance does not equal love. So we need to move beyond, and this was a theme from my talk in December, we need to move beyond diversity and inclusion, even in the dialogues that we have and what we call our dialogues. We need to move beyond that frame. And we also need to think about, why is it that we have so many diversity dialogues and discussions? And here I'm talking far beyond Harvard. Of course, Stony Brook, where I teach, across the board in higher education, in corporate America, diversity, equity, and inclusion has become a branding mechanism for many organizations to claim that they're already anti-racist. And I find that a lot of audiences are not actually clear on the history of why we spend so much time talking about diversity, especially in higher education. And so I want to just say, since I am speaking to an audience of staff and employees and maybe some faculty at Harvard, I want to remind people that one of the reasons we talk about diversity so often, as opposed to talking about white supremacy and systemic racism and institutional racism, is because of the impact of the 1978 Bakke Supreme Court decision. So of course, Harvard has been at the epicenter of debates over affirmative action and political attacks on affirmative action. So some of this history you may know, but I want to make sure we're just sort of all aware and level set. The 1978 Bakke decision, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, that was the Supreme Court decision that officially made it the law of the land that it was illegal to use racial quotas in higher education. Further, the Supreme Court sided with Bakke. Bakke was a white applicant to medical school who felt that he was a victim of anti-white racism as a result of racial quotas that set aside just a very few seats for historically marginalized members of racial groups. And so part of what happened in that Supreme Court case, that decision, is that the court agreed with Bakke and decided that historical racism or historical inequality was not a legal justification for affirmative action. And so as a result of that decision, which validated the myth of anti-white racism and validated white backlash against the civil rights movement, as a result of that decision, institutions in higher education were essentially legally forced to point to diversity as their justification for any kind of affirmative action program. It couldn't be related to actually addressing historical injustice, which is just, I mean, to be quite blunt with you, that in and of itself is white supremacist. So if you have a society that for centuries established and practiced a racial hierarchy that positioned people socially defined as white at the top and literally built its wealth on the backs of enslaved people of African descent, as well as the genocide of indigenous people and land theft of indigenous people. If you have a society that was built on xenophobic policies that for well over 50 years banned Asian people from even coming to this country as immigrants, systematic forms of discrimination and hatred and white supremacist ideology and practice embedded, to paraphrase Dr. King, into our textbooks and our culture. If you have that, and at the end of the day, you say, well, you know what, not that we could do about the past, because if we try to address that, we'll be disadvantaging white people. That reinforces that system of white supremacy. And so we spend so much time talking about diversity because of white backlash to civil rights, because of white backlash to anti-racism. And that backlash, as we've seen, as we see on a daily basis, but as we saw quite dramatically on January 6th, that backlash has not gone anywhere. So what are, I'm sorry, I did change. I did have 10 steps for anti-racist change, but I changed this for you because I said folks need something that is more sort of palatable for 1 hour talk and dialogue. So we're gonna see 5 steps for anti-racist change and get into the details in a moment. The very first one, and this is one that is in the book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, is that you need to make a lifelong commitment and understand why that's necessary and really give up.
There's a big plastic bag hanging out of it.
I think we need help with muting an audience member. But as I was saying, you need to make a lifelong commitment to justice and activism and advocacy, and to understand that we need to give up magical thinking. And that is something that I point to in my text as well. We also need to recognize and challenge what I call racial gaslighting. And this is the denial of systemic racism, the denial of white supremacy, which is still very salient in our society on the part of people who want to maintain the racial status quo. Many will, and millions of people actually believe that systemic racism doesn't exist. And our former president, Donald Trump, said so publicly, even though there's some evidence privately, that he acknowledged systemic racism, but in public would say, yeah, doesn't exist. We need to learn about racism and anti-racism within the institutions where we work, where we go to school, and in our local community. And I think the twin aspects of that history are very important. We have to face that history of racism and ongoing realities of systemic racism right where we are, but also look at the historical examples of anti-racism. And all of this work has to actually be about shifting power and resources. And yes, this is also from How to Be Less Stupid About Race. We do need to listen to Black women, understanding that Black women are not a monolith. And this is a shout out to Black feminist thought. And I'm going to say more about that a bit later. So what does it mean to make a lifelong commitment? And why is that necessary? And what are some of the challenges and barriers to that kind of a vision of anti-racist change? Well, many of you know Fannie Lou Hamer, nobody's free until everybody's free. That is a well-known quote of hers, as well as the civil rights sort of anthem, freedom is a constant struggle. So whether we're thinking about the idea that anti-racism is really about a broader commitment to social justice and human rights and dignity, or the fact that today's anti-racist struggles are the result of intergenerational work, right? In fact, when we undertake a commitment to imagining and building a better society, better world, part of what we're doing is also thinking beyond our own lifetime. So it's not even just about you making a lifelong commitment, it's about thinking about the next generation to come, as well as the generations behind us and the shoulders that we stand on. So yes, we actually have to have a very, very long-term understanding of social change. Part because the pace of change is so slow. It extends beyond one lifetime. And for me, as an educator and a scholar who works on these issues and teaches about anti-racism, one of the things, yes, that demoralizes me is precisely the slow pace of change. But on the flip side, what gives me hope is the work that's been done for generations that informs and invigorates what we do today. So it's really important, if you are new to thinking about and learning about issues not of race, but racism and anti-racism, that you understand there are no quick fixes. The Derek Chauvin verdict is not a quick fix. It's not even a fix. And we're dealing with a system of oppression that was built over the course of centuries. And so we're also going to have to think about long-term social change, and yet somehow not be completely overwhelmed by that. And I'm just gonna go ahead and throw out now a quote that I like to usually save towards the end, but that's from Mariam Kaba, who is an abolitionist, educator, and organizer, who has a recent book that just came out, We Do This Till We Free Us, which I recommend everyone get your hands on. I'm learning a lot from it. I've learned a lot from Mariam Kaba's work over the years. And one of her well-known quotes is that hope is a discipline. Hope is a discipline. And again, acknowledging the work that's being done now, but also that's been done for generations, is part of what renews my hope. And so I hope as we move forward in our discussion today that you understand, if you've already complaining about ally fatigue, or if you're sort of feeling, you're tired of doing this work, particularly this is true, if we're thinking about allies, true of white Americans, if you're tired, you're part of the problem. And that takes some introspection and reflexivity to sit with, because you really might be feeling that way. In all honesty, you may be feeling tired of the work that's actually required to change the society for the better. But I would invite you to imagine what it's like to feel the fatigue of generations when you are a member of historically oppressed groups. Whatever you can feel as a white ally cannot compare to the weight and the toll of that. Ask Indigenous people, ask African Americans and other folks who have been dealing with these collective problems and forms of violence for centuries, how tired we are. So you need to tough it up if you feel ally fatigue, because also the people in your community or in your colleagues who are people of color and Black folks and Indigenous people, if you are actually going to show up and advocate for them, you need to deal with your ally fatigue. And this is a question that comes up in a number of contexts. And one of the things I suggest is that white folks work together. If you are aspirationally an anti-racist, you aspire to be an anti-racist and a change agent for social justice, I think a lot of that work needs to happen internally among white folks. You within your community can deal with your ally fatigue, because that's certainly not a burden that I have time for, or any Black folks and people of color have time for. That's white folks' work. So we need to gird ourselves for the long term, but also find sources of hope in the sort of historical legacies of the anti-racist advocacy that's been done for generations. Okay, step 2. Now, hopefully that it's clear to you that you actually have to make a lifelong commitment. I think it's also very, very important that you understand there are folks who are also making a lifelong commitment to white supremacy and to denying systemic racism and denying the realities of our racial paradigm, which has been white supremacist. And so I want you to become wig snatchers of white supremacy and wig snatchers of gaslighting. Gaslighting is a term I write about in How to Be Less Stupid About Race. Some of you might be familiar with it. It actually comes out of just sort of work around psychological abuse in relationships. So in a context of abuse, for example, an abuser will deny that the violence is taking place. And the target of that violence is then left to struggle with reality being turned on its head. If you're experiencing abuse, experiencing violence, and the perpetrator saying it's not happening or blaming you for that violence, we can see parallels in the gaslighting that occurs at a societal level when centuries of racism are denied, if not brushed under the rug, then just completely denied, and targets of white supremacist violence are blamed for that violence. And some concrete examples of what that denial looks like. In some respects, it's polarized politically. This is from last year. Republican Scott Perry made headlines when he said that systemic racism doesn't exist. And this was specifically in the context of George Floyd's lynching. That is, in the context of having seen the world saw those over 8 minutes of George Floyd being killed by Derek Chauvin. And of course, the incredible amount of empirical data we have on systemic racism and policing. Scott Perry nevertheless insists systemic racism is not a thing. As mentioned earlier, former President Trump publicly said that he didn't believe that there's any systemic racism in the United States, much less specifically in policing. So to some extent, this is polarized, but we're not just dealing with a problem of competing political narratives. There is widespread manufactured ignorance about the realities of systemic racism in our society. This is some data from the Pew Research Center. And this is from 2019, demonstrating that when you ask, what are the factors that you think impede Black people's ability to get ahead, when we look at that data, we see only 54% of white Americans acknowledge that racial discrimination is one of those factors. And unsurprisingly, the targets of that discrimination, Black people, 84% of them acknowledge that discrimination, which is systemic, is a factor. And we see across the board, actually other research from Pew, for example, illustrates that Asian Americans are more likely than other groups to acknowledge that they are being targeted by systemic discrimination. And this is an insight more generally about the sociology of racism and the sociology of power dynamics and inequity more broadly. The people who are being targeted tend to know more about that, either through lived experience or observing what's happening to their community members. But I also want you to pay attention to that figure at the top of your screen, 84% of Black Americans, right? And this is, again, a percentage of those who say that racial discrimination impedes Black people's ability to get ahead. That number's not 100%. That number's not 100%. And so African Americans, like all of the groups, are ideologically diverse. And not all members of groups that are historically and still being targeted by systemic racism actually acknowledge that and actually feel that that is the case. And this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, writing about in my own work, but also talking with students about their own subjective perceptions of racism. To what extent they acknowledge and actually feel that they're experiencing racism. That number is never 100%. Now I want to delve a little more deeply into thinking about these issues of movement and activism at Harvard itself. Obviously as an alumna, but also simply as a scholar of the history of racism. And Harvard has been at the center of that history, in part because its history is longer than the history of the United States, right? I mean, of course, the university founded before the founding of the nation. So the sort of emergence of modern racism in the context of colonialism and the context of chattel slavery is a history that is at the center of Harvard's history as well. And we also have a history of anti-racism, often led by the work of Black people and people of color who've been at Harvard and surviving systemic racism at Harvard, and providing resources, intellectual and political resources for challenging white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So I want to get into some of that in a moment. So I begin this section of my talk with what I see as a straightforward observation, that is that Harvard has been an epicenter of elitism, of course, and white supremacy for centuries. And it remains so today. It remains so. And I think we really need to normalize acknowledging that, not just at Harvard, but I think that Harvard could do some good by practicing this, but across the board. Institutions of higher education, corporations, organizations that remain racist, that have a history of racism, we need to normalize that acknowledgement. But Harvard is a particular case because, as mentioned before, it has a history not only intertwined with slavery, but also with white supremacist science, eugenics, both in terms of what was being taught and what was being researched at the university, and what was being advocated in policies, and straight through to the Supreme Court, which also had the distinction of embracing eugenics on the court, in part because of the influence of Harvard-educated justice. So Harvard has been an epicenter of elitism and white supremacy, still is, and we need to face that concretely. So what you're seeing on your screen here is a story from earlier this year. Many of you may have seen this when it was published, but a story about possible remains of enslaved people found at Harvard Museum's collections. And many of us received an email from the president about this and the investigation that's being done. And just sort of sitting with what it means for some of our most revered institutions of higher learning, extraordinarily influential institutions like Harvard and other Ivy League universities. I'm gonna come back to that in a moment. But for these, highly influential institutions to have normalized the debasement of Black life to the point where body parts and remains are kept as specimens, sometimes lost, abandoned, but really that being part of a process of dehumanizing that is inextricably linked to the police violence against Black communities that we still see today, the disparities in health and education that we still see today, but the ordinary, quotidian, banal anti-Blackness that really has been at the core of our institutions of higher learning, including Harvard. I mentioned other Ivy League universities because, something that I found nightmarish was reported on yesterday. And that was, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the MOVE bombing, but there was a bombing several decades ago in Philadelphia. The city of Philadelphia bombed a community of Black people, including children, killed children. And it was reported yesterday that the bones of some of those children that were murdered by the city of Philadelphia were acquired by the University of Pennsylvania, studied like specimens, passed on to Princeton, which then subsequently lost the bones of these Black kids that were killed by the city of Philadelphia. Even worse, there's actually a video made by a professor at Princeton playing with these bones as some kind of pedagogical exercise. It's just horrifying, the degrees of and the depths of anti-Blackness that we're still dealing with. So these are not just things of the past, right? These are elements of our institutional cultures that we have to face if we're going to change it. Adam Cohen wrote a book years ago entitled Imbeciles, the Supreme Court, American Eugenics, and the Sterilization of Carrie Buck. And one of the things he says about Harvard is that it was more central to American eugenics than any other university. And in grappling with that, right? I mean, this is well documented at this point. Where are the reparations for that? What is happening at Harvard to demand more than exposés and acknowledgement? What about reparations? What would that even look like? And how could community members demand more than words and acknowledgement? Speaking of words, some of you may have seen just last month in the Crimson reported a story about the presence of the KKK at Harvard University. And one of the things that was also reported on was the burning of a cross in Harvard Yard. And in the coverage of this in the Crimson, they point out that Black students at Harvard, this is 1952 that this cross burning occurred. Black students at Harvard, of which there were very few, were the ones who had to stand up and protest this. And they waited to see if any of their white peers would say something and sort of protest this very obvious expression of white supremacist hatred and anti-Blackness, and no one did. And so they took it upon themselves, as Black folks want to do, and they wrote the Crimson to Black Harvard students, wrote to express their dismay and to document what happened. And part of what comes out of a reckoning with this history is that there's been maybe in recent years some talk about Harvard and slavery and this thing of the past, and there's been less of a focus on, Harvard as a bastion of not just white supremacy in its curricula and in its politics, but even extremist groups, domestic terrorists like the KKK, finding safe harbor in Harvard Yard. As mentioned throughout my talk, we have also, just as there's been this current and ongoing practice of white supremacy at Harvard, we have also seen, particularly over the last 120 years, the emergence of an anti-racist tradition led particularly by Black students and students of color, and to some extent faculty and staff. But there is a tradition of anti-racism and other forms of justice movements that I think are very important to learn about and become more aware of. And even as an alumna, I've only begun to scratch the surface, but I want to share some of this with you. You may or may not be aware of this. It's published in the Crimson in the wake of Dr. Martin Luther King's murder. This was a list of demands that was published by the Harvard Association of African and African American Students as a part of their organizing to demand action in the wake of this killing. They said, "Fair Harvard, do you mourn Martin Luther King? Here's some things you can do," right? Because we need to move beyond words. Number one, establish an endowed chair for Black professor. 2, establish courses relevant to Blacks at Harvard. 3, establish more lower level Black faculty members. And 4, admit a number of Black students proportionate to our percentage of the population. Now, we can look at these demands and look at some of what's changed and not changed at Harvard and see elements of progress and stagnation, but we still see headlines and just ordinary daily realities of Black faculty, even Cornell West being denied tenure review. We see other cases of a Latina faculty member who was denied tenure, the underrepresentation of faculty of color, a lack of investment in ethnic studies and in anti-racist scholarship more broadly, even as there has been the establishment, of course, of African American Studies department, which was the result of this activism, this student activism. So it's this work of these organized students that did, in fact, bring some of this change to Harvard, and yet still so much work left to be done, both at the level of faculty and staff and at administration. In December, I talked about Harvard's role in actually being a birthplace, in some respects, of critical race scholarship. And I think it's important to acknowledge that, both in terms of contemporary and scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, who was a graduate student at Harvard Law when she helped usher in critical race theory as a contemporary intellectual movement. Derek Bell, of course, one of the founders also of critical race theory. But we could stretch further back in time to W.B. Du Bois, the first African-American to earn a PhD at Harvard, whose work is also central in many ways to critical race scholarship today. And Du Bois, like me, felt that he was at Harvard but not of it, and also wrote about, as did Carter G. Woodson, wrote about racism at Harvard and experienced systemic racism as a Black scholar at the turn of the 20th century. And this has been written about to great extent by sociologists like Earl Wright and Alden Morris, who have documented the ways in which Du Bois was on the forefront of not just developing sociology, but also critical race work more broadly. But so Harvard is connected to the history of anti-racist scholarship insofar as Black scholars and scholars of color and some white allies have been involved in challenging racism at the university. Derek Bell's famous decision to boycott in many ways, or to stop, to do a work stoppage, to demand greater diversity in hiring at Harvard Law as a form of political action. Now, of course, there are some people who can't just engage in work stoppage. He was a privileged law professor, but there are many people who can afford to take such risks and don't. And so thinking about the legacies of activism, scholar activism at Harvard, I think is also a source of, well, knowledge about the institution and also inspiration for those who are doing anti-racist work today. Also want to briefly say a word about unions and protests and activism, because labor organizing is important at Harvard. As mentioned earlier at the onset of my talk, this is an image from protests to support Marvin Bird, who at the time was in his 60s, partially disabled worker, and had been forced to reduce their hours and really treated poorly by the university. And it was the solidarity of his union, as well as students protesting, that brought awareness to what was happening to him. And I just want to share that also as someone who's a faculty member and an employee on a campus that has a union. That is incredibly important to the practice of anti-racism, but also to the practice of forcing our institutions to take social justice seriously. A fourth step that I think is incredibly important as you make a long-term commitment to activism and to awareness, the understanding that that also involves political education and advocacy. So what can that look like concretely? These are just some ideas. And I would point you, again, as I said earlier, I'd point you to activists and organizers in your own community to look at examples where you are. But as you do so, I think it's important, in order to not feel overwhelmed, and this is something that Miriam Kaba advocates, is to choose an area of impact. Choose an area of impact, because we cannot all do everything and study everything at the same time. You have your own, sort of personal passions, things you might be inclined to or interested in learning about, your own life experiences. So you may want to focus on education, literally education, higher education, or you may want to focus on issues of health and environmental racism, or you may want to focus on the experiences of Black women and women of color and girls of color and intersectionality, right? So there are all these different ways in which it's important to think through the area of impact that's most meaningful to you, and then kind of focus on that. And that can change over the course of a month, a year, a lifetime. But you don't have to do everything at once. Choose an area of impact. And as you do so, commit to civic engagement. And that involves staying informed on local issues, what's going on with regard to racism and anti-racism at Harvard, in Cambridge, in Boston, right? And so on and so on. And that's also part of the ongoing work, because unfortunately, as many of you may know from following the news, that it's going to keep coming, and we need to know what's going on so that we can be a part of anti-racist advocacy. So learn about community organizing. Who are the organizers where you are who are already doing the work? Support labor unions and advocate for marginalized communities. This is part of what it means to be a compassionate and active citizen. Okay, so the fifth and final concrete step I want to leave you with as we think about listening to Black women, and I'm going to say more about that in a moment, but shifting power and resources, and shifting power and resources in ways that build in an intersectional perspective. And this is why listening to Black women, I explain in my book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, is really important, because we can't just think about race and racism. We have to think about how race and racism intersect with class oppression, with sexism and patriarchy and gender inequality, with one's status as an LGBTQ individual, with disability, and really think through our resource distribution with an intersectional sensibility. And that comes also from Black women like Kimberly Crenshaw, again, to bring in the Harvard connection. So we have to reimagine resources and power. I've been hearing that various institutions, including Harvard, are having new discussions about budgets. And I think it's important to understand, and you've probably seen this before, but budgets are moral documents. And we need to bring anti-racism and a racial justice and an intersectional justice lens into literally our budgets. What's being funded, where do we need to invest our resources? And we could think about that also in terms of divesting from harmful policies and institutions. We need to address inequitable distribution of resources, invest in our communities. That's why we hear abolitionists like Mariame Kaba and others, and Angela Davis and others, speak to the need to pay attention to the fact that we have billions of dollars being poured into policing, for example, to go back to the killing of George Floyd and many others. Billions of dollars being poured into policing, military-grade equipment being used against our communities. That money could be better spent and allocated by investing in our neighborhoods, in education, in health, in practices that will actually keep us safe and reduce harm. And supporting mutual aid networks, that's a concrete thing. And you can, Harvard even keeps a database of mutual aid networks locally and nationally, perhaps as well, that you can support. This is something everyone should have on their radar. Okay, listen to Black women. This is the bonus. Listen to Black women. What do I mean? I've already talked about intersectionality, Black feminist thought, but I want to share with you some images. And this will be wrapping up in the next couple of minutes. But as mentioned earlier, Black women are not a monolith. These are some of the many Black women that inform my understanding and my advocacy work. Everyone from Beronda Montgomery, who is upper left corner of your screen, just published with Harvard University Press, an amazing book called Lessons from Plants, but it's also a book about mentoring and inclusion and thinking about diversity in a really sophisticated way, to folks like Angela Davis, of course, who is a well-known abolitionist. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's work is so important. Barbara Smith, one of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective, Dorothy Roberts, we could just go on and on, Ruha Benjamin, Ida B. Wells, Melissa Thompson, who's done so much work on disability and racial justice. Really, what I try to convey to audience is that even as a Black woman, I had to learn to listen to Black women. I'm still learning. And it's important to hear that, because I was not born quoting Angela Davis. And until I met her at Wellesley and studied some of her work at Wellesley, I didn't know anything about Black feminist thought. And I write about that journey and how to be less stupid about race. Being educated at places like Harvard, that was not an environment that really uplifted the voices and knowledge of many historically marginalized communities, including Black women. And so even as a Black woman, I'm looking at my syllabi, I'm looking at what I'm reading and trying to diversify the perspectives, even of the Black women that I'm reading. Rekia Diallo's in the middle of your screen, was one of the foremost activists and writers working at the intersection of racism, Islamophobia, and sexism in France. So that's also a shout out to thinking beyond the lens of the United States. All right, so As we prepare to open for the Q&A and we're thinking about creating movement, what does that mean for you? What are you already doing? To go back to the question I asked at the beginning, that might be connected to ongoing anti-racist change. I want to leave us with a couple of quotes that I think really get to the depth and the breadth of the change that we need and show why we need to be involved in ongoing advocacy. It's from James Baldwin, who's just endlessly brilliant. But he wrote that in order to accommodate me, in order to accommodate so many centuries of cruelty and bad faith and genocide and fear, all the American institutions and all the American values, public and private, will have to change. And that includes our institutions of higher learning. And change is not just about thinking about reform. If we listen to Black women like Angela Davis, like Miriam Kaba, it's also about imagining abolition, right? And we need to really loosen our imaginations for what's possible. And that's what I learned so much from organizers like Kaba. So a man was lynched, a woman was lynched, a girl was lynched. Over and over and over again, we have seen this history repeat. What are you going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Beyond words, beyond dialogues, what are you already doing that maybe we need to support? And how can your community members and your colleagues support the needs of diverse communities in ways that actually promote equity and inspire us to stand up on an ongoing basis for anti-racist change? With that, I want to thank you for your attention, express my special gratitude to Andrea Kelton Harris, and invite you now to engage in the dialogue. So one of the great things about this event is that usually people invite me to speak and then there's like a 15-minute Q&A. We actually have until 2 o'clock to get into a Q&A, and I look forward to hearing from you now. So Andrea, did you want me to jump into questions or are you going to moderate? I can't hear you, just so you know.
Sorry. Yes, why don't you jump into the questions? I know there was one that we had from last time that you were going to answer.
Well, that one, that was about trust, right? Trust and how do we, so I think one of the questions that wasn't answered last December was, what do you do if you're building relationships, across racial and ethnic lines, and people might be feeling what I was talking about earlier in terms of ally fatigue? How do you deal with that? What does trust have to do with the relationships we need to build in order to bring about anti-racist change? Yes, I'll repeat one of the things I said in the talk, and that is we really need to get critical about ally fatigue. And I actually think that is a problem for white folks to work on. I think you need to be in community with other white people who might be feeling that and need a space to express it, but not a space in which Black people and people of color will have to perform emotional and intellectual labor. That's for white folks to do. And in terms of trust, trust is really hard, particularly in environments where we work. And I think I'll speak from my own experience. I'd say that one of the things that served me is being honest. So I have had conversations with white colleagues in my profession where I've told them straight up, I don't trust you. I don't trust you. But trust can be earned, and I'm willing to allow for there to be space and time for trust to be earned and built. But I think we have to be honest with each other. If there's not an existing trusting relationship, and why would there be unless there'd been effort to build that? I think we need to be honest. And I think part of resisting white supremacy is Black folks and people of color being honest about what we're experiencing and not catering to the comfort of our white colleagues and bosses. And that's hard, particularly if we're talking about our bosses. That's hard for white people not to cater to the whims of their white bosses. So I think having, sort of figuring out whether your colleague is someone you can be honest with and having a conversation about that, right? Like, I need to be able to have hard conversations with you. If I can't have that conversation with you, then we just need to know that. We just need to know that. So that's part of how I would respond.
Thank you very much. I see that we have a couple of hands up. Claire Putnam. Claire?
Oh, Claire.
Yeah. Hi, thank you, Crystal. This is great. So good to see you. Well, I have a lot of thoughts and ideas. And one thing I think is a big problem for a lot of white people. I mean, I'm speaking for myself, and I think probably a lot of white people, is that white people don't fully understand the legacies of slavery and white supremacy, and really how broadly white supremacy kind of infiltrates our, the past and today. And maybe we don't want to see it. I mean, I'm sure there's not wanting to see it, but we don't fully understand it. And I think a friend of mine, I was texting with the other week ago, said, Claire, you have a lot of white guilt. And I thought about that, and I thought, gosh, that's interesting. And I think that it's important to take responsibility for, white supremacy and how we benefit from it, and acknowledge it. And if that's, yeah, so that's one thought.
Tell me more, Claire? Can you tell me more? First of all, it's just so nice to see you. Hi, Claire. For those who don't know, Claire and I know each other from when I was in graduate school. Claire was super supportive and just is a gem of, and Harvard is lucky to still have her. But Claire, could you tell me more, maybe an awkward question, but what does white guilt actually mean to you? Because it's actually something that, I have to read about intellectually and hear people talk about, but I don't understand it.
Well,
so I always want people to explain. And it means different things to different people. What is white guilt to you?
I'd never heard the term before. A friend, and we were having kind of a heated discussion, and she said, you have white guilt. And I really was thinking about it. I felt defensive.
Yeah. And it doesn't sound good.
I don't want it. I mean, sorry.
Yeah, like it doesn't sound good. I don't think a lot of people be told.
It doesn't sound good, but on the other hand, we have to take responsibility. And if looking at some of the awful things that our forebears have done, that's part of it. But that's different from, I think, from, like, I don't want to be paralyzed by afraid of it.
I feel, well, I could just maybe respond in this way. And you may have had something else you wanted to say. Did you want to say that first, and then we could talk about white guilt?
No, go ahead.
Well, I would just say, as a sociologist, I think one of the most important things for people to understand, and this includes white people, but people of all backgrounds, is to understand the history that produced the white supremacist structures that we're still living with. Because, first of all, without that history, we really can't make sense of the depth and the breadth of the problem, to your earlier point. And it is a horrific history. So if you are inclined to study history, you will find endless, really disturbing resources about the scope of white supremacy and colonial violence and chattel slavery and all of it, racial capitalism. So there's a lot to learn. And I think there's some primers and books and documentaries that do a good job of kind of summarizing this complex history in a way that you can begin to grasp just how profound it is. But I think that history is also important for understanding that we are shaped by these, huge collective forces that are beyond us as individuals. And so I don't necessarily think that means learning history and learning about sort of how we're shaped by social forces means that you won't experience or be accused of experiencing white guilt. But I do think it's important to move beyond the individual level. That, of course, we have personal responsibility and accountability for the choices that we make in our lives now. But we did not create, none of us created the racial paradigm that we were socialized into. And that shapes our biases and our social lenses and our the gaps in understanding. We didn't create any of that. So I don't think about these issues in terms of individual guilt, except maybe when we're talking about actual incidents between individuals of, Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck. Yeah, I think we can talk about personal accountability, but even there, I have to be honest and say I'm learning a lot from abolitionists who even say, well, even if we're thinking about accountability, we actually need to have a more sophisticated and honest conversation about that and question whether, the prison industrial complex actually provides accountability or justice. I don't think it does. But for many, it's something, right? A guilty verdict is something. And I don't want to minimize that and the meaning of that historically also because, generally people have not been, police included, held accountable for these kinds of acts of violence. So that's just some reactions that I have to hearing about white guilt. But what was the other idea that you wanted to share?
That
Maybe you didn't have another one. I thought
well,
you did.
you know what? That's really, thanks. That's really interesting. Good to hear your reactions. I'll let others talk, share.
Okay.
Thank you, Claire.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have Tina Bowen who has a question, and then I have a question in the chat.
Okay, great.
Hi. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you for being so direct and so honest and so real. And I love your hashtag. Thank you for that. And really being here as you. That's so helpful for me to hear other people's lived experiences. And I really value that. Knowing our history is so important. And in my department, we had a presentation in the fall with Debbie Irving and Shea Stewart Poulet.
Yeah.
And Debbie Irving was really able to talk to the white folks in the room and say, hey, here's my story. And I bet your story is really similar. When we grew up, this was the education that we had, and this is what we were told about history, yada, yada, yada. But did you know this history? Did you know that history? Did you know the other history? Did you know the other one? And this whole sense of like pulling back this veil of, we thought we knew history, but the story was, was whitewashed. It was big time whitewashed. And just, like how many of us, I mean, for myself, just hearing about, with the Black Wall Street, I'd never heard of that. And finding out that whole history and how it came about and everything. I mean, that whole, as much of that history as I have now been exposed to, which is much more than I'd ever before, was just, whoa, that was hugely expansive. So that's part of my stepping out and doing my work. And I'm not here to toot my horn. I'm just saying, like, as a white person, have become more educated about things that history that wasn't handed to me, whether it was maliciously kept from me or just that's that is the systemic racism that we're all growing up under, or
Right.
that so many of us are growing up under, is a big thing. So I think that's huge. But the other question I had is, and the other thing I want to say is, hearing other people's lived experiences, really understanding the stories at a deep level. One of the most disturbing, horrific things is, I read the details of a lynching that I'm not going to go into here. And there's one thing to hear the word lynching, and there's another thing to hear the horrendous details. And this is just one of countless. I'm just so sick to my stomach by the whole description of the thing, that there could
Yeah.
be a crowd of people cheering on such the most heinous, horrific act against another human being has affected me so deeply. And I know that's one story, but the word lynching isn't just, oh, somebody got beat up or killed. It's
Right.
like the most disgusting images possible. And again, I said, that's one story, like, and that already is traumatizing, you know, and I'm so far removed from it. But where I want to go is something you said at the very end. So again, validating all of that important. We've got to get educated. We've got to know. You said something about imagination, and something that is so key to me is knowing what we want to create. What is that image that we hold that we are working collectively to bring about?
Yeah.
So again, getting a full picture, understanding all of it, but where are we going? What's the vision that we're moving towards, the society that we want to create? Because I feel like the more we develop that image,
Yeah.
you know, an awareness of
Yeah.
all the forces pulling against us, the more we can actually move to create that and make that happen. So thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you,
Thank you, Tina. Thank you so much. I don't know what particular lynching atrocity you were thinking of, but as you were speaking, I thought of Mary Turner. And I don't know if you know that story. And if you don't, it is a horrific one. Without getting into all of the details, I will just share that Mary Turner was a Black woman who was pregnant and lynched while she was pregnant, and her baby was torn from her stomach in the midst of the lynching. And it's in that context of just this quotidian, you know, ordinary, extraordinary violence enacted against Black people, Black babies, Black women, Black men, Black boys, where you see, you know, in that context, the KKK being welcomed at Harvard, and, you know, a cross being burned in the yard, and haha. And that's one of the things that the Black students who protested this in the Crimson wrote about. They were like, this is seen as a joke to some people, despite what it all means. So it's I think the thing that shocked me about lynching, Tina, is that in teaching, you know, the classes that I teach, I learned that many students don't know this history. Many students, because it's not integrated into our educational curricula across the board. And it's just extraordinary that we have so much violence. We could get into all of the history about Indigenous peoples, plural, right? Over 500 indigenous nations in what is now called the United States. The history of these communities and the gross forms of violence to which they are still being systematically subjected is almost completely erased, not just in education, but even in news coverage and visibility of Indigenous people. A lot of research on race and racism. You look at those the polls that I showed, the polling data often just says, you know what, we didn't bother to include any Indigenous people because of the sample size. When the sample size, of course, being due to genocide. It's just, it's yes, there's a lot of work to do around grappling with and learning this history, but also the emotional impact. And I'm glad that you made that visible too, and being vulnerable in that way, because I could tell you, after all these years of doing this work, it's a lot of vicarious trauma also. And I think one of the things that institutions like Harvard, but all institutions that are now pushing, oh, we have to learn about race and racism, or we have to talk about these issues. Well, you also need to invest in mental health support for folks who are doing this work, but especially for Black folks and people of color and Asian folks and Indigenous people, for whom this is not only an academic matter. This is also a lived experience of vulnerability. And even if you are not a member of the communities, it is also vicarious trauma. It's different, but it's also vicarious trauma. And so realizing that there also needs to be some serious work around mental health support, community support for the emotional toll, the emotional labor of facing this violence. And yes, Tina, to the last point, that about imagination, that's what I'm learning from abolitionists. I feel that is where I've had the most work to do over the years, is really thinking, well, realizing how limited my imagination for change used to be. So like 10 years ago, when it came to policing, I was thinking about reform only, because that's the only lens I thought about. I mean, I didn't know anything about abolitionist politics, really. And, you know, I learned from organizers and folks and scholars who are working in abolition that is part of what sustains the status quo, our inability or unwillingness, or even just, you know, our lack of awareness that we can imagine beyond what seems possible or beyond what our current circumstances are. And it's precisely that willingness to imagine the world we wish to see, not the world we think we can get or the crumbs we think we can get, but to really be bold and imagine, well, gosh, you know, what would it be like to live in a world where we didn't see these forms of violence, where we are relating to each other in a way that isn't just honoring our common dignity as humans, but also honoring our lived environment and other species on this planet in the context right now of climate change and what is called the sixth mass extinction, the Anthropocene, right? We have a lot of work to do in terms of imagination, and it's urgent that we do it in order to be able to build a better world. So thank you so much, Tina.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I'm going to read a question from the chat, and then we have Beth Lazarus with her hand up, and we have one more question in the chat, and we have about 7 minutes left. So let's go.
13 minutes, 13 minutes.
13?
Yes, 1:47, we go to 2, right?
Yes, but we want to leave a few minutes for closing remarks.
They can make me, oh, that's true. We got 7 minutes. All right, let's go.
Okay. The question is, do you think democracy itself right now is a major obstacle in greater improvement for the country? For example, during the pandemic, the rich got richer and so many people suffered. As a white man, I have done lots of things that I am proud of and wish I could do more. I have also done some things not so great.
Well, I think that's all of us. I've done some things I'm proud of, and I've done some things not so great. So thank you for sharing. Yes, during the pandemic, right, the super wealthy have gotten exponentially more wealthy, and we've seen, you know, just economic precarity, particularly hitting communities that were already suffering and disproportionately working class and poor. So I heard the question framed in terms of democracy. Is democracy an obstacle? I think we need to talk about racial capitalism and talk about, you know, the ways in which just even the logic of, you know, profit-driven decisions at the expense of literally lives. That's an obstacle. And to the extent that corporate interests and moneyed interests have really corrupted our democracy, and this has been the case for quite some time now, and it seems to just be getting worse over time. I think that is a huge, huge problem, where the interests of our most vulnerable communities, working class, poor people, indigenous people, Black folks, that these are not the core community interests that are being represented in our among our elected officials. Not enough of them. There are some, but not enough. And so what do we do about corruption and sort of elite interests taking over our politics? We got to find some way to deal with this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Beth Lazarus?
Hi, thank you so much for talking today, Dr. Fleming. So what stood out to me, among many things, during this presentation was art that displayed those who have taken action to
I'm
like
sorry,
better
could you
understand.
repeat the last part, Beth? I didn't hear that. There was a crackling in the sound.
Yeah, I apologize. Those who have taken action to better understand racial issues, that chart like really stood out to me. And you know, my question is, with my experience at Harvard and learning and hearing people talk and getting involved, is that these conversations and these things happen in an echo chamber. It feels like it's
Yeah.
like-minded people just like validating, confirming one another. But those who like really need to hear it, those who can make the changes, and those who do all these things aren't part of these discussions, aren't part of these groups. What
Mhm.
strategies or recommendations do you have for us or for Harvard in order to like break down these walls and get these people involved?
Thank you, Beth. It's a complex but important topic, and I'll just share some reflections that I hope are helpful or useful or generative. One is that, yes, I totally understand the sort of feeling that the people who show up for an event like this or for some of the other events or initiatives you may be a part of, sometimes people feel like that's the choir, or, you know, preaching to the choir, the people who already know that this is important, we do something about it. And the folks who don't want to do anything about it or don't think it's important don't show up. That's absolutely true across the board, not just at Harvard. At the same time, sometimes I want to say that there is no choir. Sometimes I want to say that because, yes, even if you've already been doing anti-racist work and advocacy, and this is a comment especially for white folks, so it may not apply to everyone depending on your identity and your positionality, but certainly if you are a white American in these settings, you're not in the choir. And even as a Black scholar working on this topic for now decades, I don't feel like I'm the choir. I feel like I learn something every single day and I have more work to do. And I learn from my students. I learn from activists and organizers. I learn from people like you who engage with me in these events. So I don't think there's really a choir, but we still have the question of what about the people who refuse to show up and who don't think this is important. There are a couple of ideas I have about that. One has to do with some research done at Harvard. So Frank Dobbin in the Department of Sociology, where I got my PhD, he and some collaborators have done kind of research on diversity programming and workshops and why they typically don't work. And I think that's important also to acknowledge in a setting like this. It's important to understand that workshops, trainings, implicit bias trainings, we have lots of research that just documents that empirically they do not actually produce the outcomes that they're maybe intended or advertised to produce. We've had, you know, decades now of diversity programs and persistent and in some cases widening disparities, right? So if sort of these kinds of conversations that are, you know, or workshops or implicit bias trainings don't actually have the impact that people would like to see, Dobbin's research suggests that creating longer term opportunities for learning that are not forced onto people, but actually, you know, you can create some incentives for it. But, you know, that actually takes programming on the part of an institution that is not a one-off event or even just a series necessarily, but like not necessarily like a college. This is one of the things that Frank Dobbin and his colleague wrote about, not necessarily a college class, but longer term opportunities for learning that are built into programming offerings at an institution could help. And then lastly, I think the reality is that there are going to be people who, even if they have an opportunity to learn, and they don't want to because they want to maintain the status quo. And we need to be real about that. And I think we need to organize against such such forces. That's why it's important to work in community, to develop relationships of solidarity, to get involved in things like unions or to create organizations, and to build relationships to push forward policies and practices and concrete ideas that can be enacted to produce institutional change, even if there are folks who don't want to see that happen. There are going to be people who don't want to see that happen because there's backlash.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fleming. We're at 1:55, and I know there are still a couple of questions in the chat, and apologies for not getting to those. But we so appreciate all of you coming today, and I'm going to turn it over to our Dean for HR, Chris Ciotti.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Dr. Fleming. Just a couple comments before we let folks go at 12. First off, thank you everybody for coming today. It's a busy time of year. I realize all the demands on your time, and you've made time to spend 2 hours with us today. I think it was time well spent, but we're grateful for that. We are also thankful to Dean Gay and to the interim Dean Mary Ann Bradley and the FAS HR Diversity Committee for the support funding on part of the Dean Gay and Mary Ann Bradley for allowing us to provide this programming to you today. Most important, thank you to Dr. Fleming. I was at the first dialogue, obviously, and I remember thinking I could have, we listened for several hours and I could have listened for several hours more. And today I feel the exact same way. I feel like I could sit at my Zoom, which I don't even enjoy that much, and listen for another several hours. So thank you for just continuing to educate us and to inform us, and I would say inspire and motivate us in this area that we all need to learn much more about. I guess I could say more, but thank you so much for that. I think it was very meaningful for everybody who attended. These are spaces, the dialogues have traditionally been those spaces where we could have a place to have a safe conversation and share things that were often very difficult to share. And this is no exception. And with racism, anti-racism, the more we can, better understand ourselves and our history and the history of our institution, the better we will be at addressing it going forward. Andrea, as always, thank you very much for connecting us to Dr. Fleming, for spearheading the dialogues every month, for spearheading this past dialogue and the one we just shared today, and for modulating the questions. Thank you very much for that, as always.
Dr. Fleming has said that if people have questions that weren't answered, they can reach out to her on Twitter.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. That's very generous of you. So thank you for that, Andrea. I want to recognize my team because nothing happens without a team. It always takes a village. So thank you very much to Dominique Bocanagra, to Annie McGough, to Jess Bound, in addition to Andrea, for working tirelessly behind the scenes to bringing us today's program. And I want to do a special shout out to Dominique. Dominique Bocanagra is leaving us, sadly, FAS. She has taken on another role at the Hutchins Center, where we know she'll continue to be wildly successful. So we are sad for ourselves, but very happy for Dominique as she takes on a new responsibility.
Yeah.
So we're not stopping. We do the 3 dialogues every academic year, and we will also do something. We'll also do a summer panel, yet to be determined as to exactly what. There are many, many topics that would be of interest and to learn more about. So stay tuned. We'll be sharing more information after commencement. So thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Dr. Fleming, and go in peace, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Crystal.
Thank you also to
Bye.
Chris. Chris, thank you for our expert technical support.
Yes.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. What a difference it makes to have expert technical help.
It does.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
We have the scars to
Thank you.
prove it.
Right, exactly.